The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday morning. I was on a job site in Portland, standing knee-deep in blueprint revisions, when my wife's name lit up my phone. I almost didn't answer. We'd been barely speaking for 2 weeks, ever since my father's funeral, and every conversation had felt like walking across glass in bare feet. But I picked up, because part of me still believed she was the woman I married. She wasn't. Her voice was different that morning. Smooth, deliberate, like she'd practiced what she was about to say in the bathroom mirror before dialing. "The house is in my name, Marcus. You know that. I need you to find somewhere else to stay starting tonight." I didn't say anything for a long moment. On the site behind me, I could hear steel beams being welded, the hollow clang of metal against metal. "What are you talking about?" I said. "I've spoken with an estate attorney. Your father's portfolio, the properties, the commercial leases, everything I have, the documentation to show I was named co-administrator 6 months ago. It's all legal. I've already filed with the probate court." I still didn't move. I just stood there, blueprints in my hand, watching a crane swing a load of rebar overhead like it was any other Tuesday. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," she said. "I'll have a box of your things on the porch by 6. Then she hung up. "Hi, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm a structural engineer. I design buildings that are supposed to last 100 years. And for the past 4 years, I had been married to a woman who had spent almost every one of those years quietly calculating how to make sure I didn't last much longer in her life. I want to tell you this story carefully, because it isn't a simple one. It doesn't start with the phone call. It starts about 18 months before that, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and old coffee. When my father first got his diagnosis. My father was not a flashy man. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck, wore the same 4 flannel shirts in rotation, and made his own coffee every morning from grounds he measured by hand. But over the course of 40 years, quietly and without ceremony, he had assembled a portfolio of commercial real estate across 3 counties, 11 properties in total, including 2 small shopping centers, a row of professional office suites, and a warehouse he'd converted into a storage facility back in the 90s. He never talked about what it was worth. I only found out the number after he was gone. It was somewhere north of $8 million. My wife found out about that number before I did. She'd been present at a family dinner 14 months before his death when my uncle made a passing comment about the lease renewal on one of the shopping centers. She asked a few questions. Innocent enough at the time, I thought. She was just being interested. She was just being the kind of engaged, curious woman I thought I'd married. What she was actually doing was calculating. Over the following months, she began visiting my father more often. She brought him meals. She offered to drive him to his oncology appointments when I was tied up with work. She sat with him on his porch and listened to his stories, and my father, who had always been lonely since my mother passed, opened up to her in a way he never fully opened up to me. I was grateful. I told her that more than once. I was on job sites in 3 different states that year, trying to hold my career together while also being the kind of son I wanted to be on weekends. I thought my wife was helping carry the weight. She was helping herself to the keys. 11 months before my father died, while I was in Phoenix overseeing a foundation pour on a hospital project, my wife accompanied him to his attorney's office. She told him it was just to update his healthcare proxy. She told him it was a formality. She told him it would make everything easier. My father, who trusted her, signed documents he didn't fully read. His eyesight had been failing since the 2nd round of chemo, and his attorney at the time, a man named Gerald Huff, who had handled my father's affairs for decades, had recently retired. The new attorney was someone my wife had specifically recommended. She had been planning this for nearly a year. By the time my father passed in February, on a gray morning while I sat beside his bed holding his hand, my wife had already positioned herself as co-administrator of his estate with sweeping authority over asset distribution. She had done it slowly, patiently, one signature at a time. And she had done it in a way that she believed was airtight. She was wrong. When I got home from the job site that Tuesday, my duffel bag and a cardboard box were sitting on the front porch exactly as promised. She had taped the top of the box shut with clear packing tape and written my name on it in black marker in her neat, architectural handwriting, like I was a package being returned to sender. I stood there for a moment looking at it. Then I looked at my phone. There were exactly 48 hours remaining. I'll explain what that means. 2 weeks before my father died, on a Thursday afternoon when the hospice nurse had stepped out and it was just the 2 of us in his room, my father handed me a sealed envelope. He was weak by then, his voice barely above a murmur, but his eyes were steady. "Don't open that now," he said. "Don't open it until after I'm gone and you need it. You'll know when." I'd assumed it was a letter. Something personal. I put it in the inner pocket of my jacket and told him I loved him, and we sat quietly together watching the light change on the wall until he fell asleep. I didn't open it until the night of my wife's phone call. Inside was not a letter. Inside was a contact name, a phone number, and 8 words written in my father's careful, deliberate hand. Call Daniel. Tell him the window is open. 48 hours. I called the number before I even touched the cardboard box on the porch. The man who answered introduced himself as Daniel Rourke. He had a calm, unhurried voice, the kind that belongs to men who have spent 40 years in courtrooms and stopped being startled by anything decades ago. He told me he had been my father's attorney for the past 14 months, not Gerald Huff's replacement, but a private arrangement my father had made quietly, specifically because he'd seen what my wife was doing. He said my father had come to him alone, without telling anyone, after recognizing what was happening with his estate documents. He'd been sharp until the very end, my father. He just let her believe he wasn't. Everything my wife had signed, every document she believed gave her administrative control, had been structured around a trust. My father had established 3 months earlier, a trust that carried a 48-hour challenge window, specifically designed to be triggered in the event of a breach of fiduciary good faith. The challenge had to be filed within 48 hours of any adverse action taken against me, the named primary beneficiary. My wife throwing me out of the house and filing with the probate court counted as adverse action. The clock had started when she made the call. Daniel told me to come to his office. He told me to bring the envelope. I picked up my duffel bag, left the cardboard box on the porch exactly where she'd put it, and drove downtown. My wife was celebrating that night. I found out later she'd called her sister and 2 friends, opened a bottle of wine she'd apparently been saving, and ordered delivery from the kind of restaurant we never went to together because she always said it was too expensive. She told them the estate was handled. She told them she'd been patient and strategic and that it had paid off exactly the way she'd planned. She didn't know that 40 blocks away, Daniel Rourke and I were sitting across from each other at a conference table, working through the paperwork that would render every assumption she'd made null and void. I want to be honest about something. There was a version of that night where I felt triumphant, where I sat across from Daniel and let the vindication wash over me like something warm. But that's not actually what I felt. What I felt was tired. The specific exhaustion of a man who has realized that someone he loved was never entirely real. That what he'd mistaken for a partnership was a performance she'd been running since the beginning. I thought about the first apartment we'd shared, in a city we'd both been new to. The way she used to leave me coffee on the counter before I woke up, whether that had been real, or whether it had just been the early stages of something else. Daniel walked me through the challenge documents carefully. He explained each piece in plain language, because that was the kind of man my father had chosen, someone who believed people deserved to understand what was being done on their behalf. The trust my father had structured placed the primary estate assets inside a protective shell that my wife's co-administrator designation could not touch without my explicit consent. Her paperwork gave her the appearance of authority. The trust made that appearance hollow. The 48-hour challenge, once filed, would trigger a mandatory freeze on all estate assets pending full probate review, during which her administrative rights would be suspended. The freeze hit her accounts at 2:09 inches the morning. I was sitting in a hotel 2 miles from our house, drinking bad coffee from the room machine, when Daniel texted me to confirm. I didn't feel like celebrating. I turned the TV on low and watched the ceiling. She found out the next morning when she tried to authorize a payment on behalf of the estate and the transfer was flagged. I didn't watch her panic from a distance the way some people might have. I didn't need to. Daniel's office received 3 increasingly urgent calls from her new attorney within the first 2 hours. By noon, she had left me 6 voicemails. The first one was cold and lawyerly. The second one had an edge. By the 4th, her voice had changed into something I didn't fully recognize, tighter, higher, like a wire being pulled too taut. I didn't return any of them. Instead, I drove to a neighborhood on the east side of the city where my father had owned a small professional building, 4 office suites, a dentist practice on the ground floor, and an accounting firm on the second. I sat in the parking lot for a while, just looking at it. My father had bought that building for $340,000 in 1998. He'd repainted it twice, replaced the roof once, fixed the boiler 3 times. He knew the dentist's name and the names of her kids. He had built something real. And he had made sure, even at the end, even when his body was failing and his vision was going, that what he built would go to the right place. I went home the hotel, which was home for now, and I called my cousin, who is an architect, to ask if she knew anyone looking for office space. 3 days after the challenge was filed, my wife's attorney made a formal attempt to challenge the trust itself, arguing that my father had lacked the cognitive capacity to establish it. It was a predictable move, and Daniel had anticipated it. My father had undergone a formal cognitive evaluation on the same day he signed the trust documents. Daniel had arranged it, with documentation, specifically to foreclose that argument. The challenge failed within a week. On the day the probate judge signed the order, affirming the trust, my wife was sitting in her own attorney's office going through her options. I know this because Daniel was CC'd on a series of correspondence, and because the world is smaller than people think it is. Her options were limited. What she had assumed was a fortress, the co-administrator designation. The documents she'd coaxed from a man with failing eyesight and an unfamiliar attorney turned out to be a room with no load-bearing walls. It looked solid from the outside. It couldn't hold anything up. I want to tell you about the letter my father left, the actual one, which was separate from the envelope he handed me in the hospital room. Daniel gave it to me at our third meeting, after the probate order had been signed. It was 2 pages, handwritten, on the yellow legal pad paper my father had always used. His handwriting was looser than usual in places you could see where his hand had tired, but it was all there, every word deliberate. He wrote that he had known something was wrong 14 months before he died, when he noticed my wife's questions had a particular quality to them. Not curious, he wrote. Measuring. He said he hadn't told me because he didn't want me to have to live with the knowledge while also trying to be a good son and a good husband at the same time. He said he knew I was doing my best to hold everything together. He wrote that he had not been angry at her, exactly. That he understood people sometimes become the worst version of themselves when they can see money on the horizon. That understanding it didn't make it acceptable, but it made it comprehensible. He wrote that the estate, upon full resolution, was to be divided in a specific way. 1/3 to me, outright. The remaining 2/3 to a scholarship fund he had named for my mother, to provide full tuition support for first-generation college students in the county where he'd built his first building. He had been planning that fund for years. He just needed a trustworthy administrator. He left that role to me. I sat in Daniel's conference room with those 2 pages for a long time after Daniel stepped out to give me privacy. I thought about my father driving his 12-year-old truck. The 4 flannel shirts. The measured coffee grounds. The way he'd spent 40 years building something and never once led with it. He had written one more thing at the bottom of the second page, in smaller letters, as if he'd added it as an afterthought. But knowing my father, it was anything but. The buildings are just buildings, Marcus. It's what you do with the ground underneath them that matters. I think you've always known that. Build something that lasts. I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket. I didn't go back to the house for 3 weeks. When I finally did, it was to collect the rest of my things on a weekday afternoon while my wife was out. We'd arranged it through the attorneys, which is a particular kind of strange, coordinating your own absence through intermediaries. The rooms felt smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd just spent enough time outside them to realize they were never really mine to begin with. I left the house key on the kitchen counter. Not out of bitterness. Just because I didn't need it anymore. I moved into a rental on the other side of the city, a 2-bedroom near the river with tall windows and noisy pipes and a landlord who delivered tomatoes from his garden in the summer. It was the best place I'd lived in years, though it took me a while to understand why. It was mine, in the simplest sense. Nothing in it was contested. Every morning I woke up in it, I knew exactly where I stood. My wife tried one more approach the following month. She retained a second attorney and submitted an emotional distress filing, alleging that I had manipulated my father during his final months to exclude her from rightful consideration. It was the legal equivalent of throwing something at a wall you already know is solid. Daniel handled it. The filing was dismissed. Her second attorney withdrew shortly thereafter. I heard from her once more after that. Not through an attorney. An actual voicemail, left on a Sunday evening, her voice quieter than I'd heard it in years. She said she thought she'd been doing what she had to do. She said she knew how that sounded. She said she wasn't sure anymore when she'd stopped trusting that things would work out without a plan. I listened to it twice. I didn't call back. I didn't call back because there wasn't anything useful to say, and because I'd learned something over the preceding months that I hadn't fully understood before. Forgiveness and engagement are not the same thing. You can extend one without offering the other. The voicemail got filed in a folder I don't open often. The scholarship fund launched 8 months after my father's passing, on a Thursday morning in early October, which would have been his birthday. We held a small ceremony at the community center 2 blocks from the first building he'd ever purchased. About 40 people came: former tenants, neighbors, Daniel, my cousin, the architect, a few people from the county that my father had simply known for decades because that was the kind of man he was. A local school principal spoke about what tuition access meant for families in the district. One of the first scholarship recipients, a 19-year-old planning to study civil engineering, shook my hand afterward and said she'd looked up some of my projects. I didn't know what to do with that. I thanked her. I told her the field was hard and worth it. Walking out to the parking lot afterward, Daniel fell into step beside me. He was a tall man, unhurried in the way he moved, and he waited until we were out of earshot of the others before he said anything. He talked about you a lot, you know. In our meetings. He had his hands in his coat pockets, looking toward the street. He was proud of what you built. Not just professionally. I nodded. I didn't say anything, because I didn't trust myself to. He told me once, Daniel continued, that the best structures are the ones you can't see. The foundations. The load-bearing elements. Everything that holds the visible parts up. We reached my truck. I leaned against the driver's door for a moment, looking at the building down the street, the first one my father ever bought, brick facade, modest, still standing. He said, "You always understood that," Daniel said. Even when you didn't know he was watching. I drove home along the river road. The windows were down, because it was one of those October days that hadn't made up its mind yet between summer and fall, and the air coming off the water had that particular clean weight to it. I thought about the house I'd shared with my wife. About the box on the porch with my name in black marker. About the way she'd said, "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," as if simplicity had ever been something she genuinely valued. I thought about my father in that hospital room, handing me an envelope with 8 words on it, trusting that I would know what to do and when to do it. I thought about the 19-year-old who wanted to study civil engineering. Some people spend their lives building things they want others to see, monuments to their own ambition, visible from a distance, designed to impress. My father never did that. He built slowly, quietly, in ways that lasted. He built relationships with tenants who stayed for 15 years. He built a legal structure so careful that it held even when someone tried to pull it apart from the inside. He built a son who understood, eventually, that the most important work is often the work nobody watches you do. I'm not going to tell you I came out of this clean. The divorce was not easy in the administrative sense. There were months of paperwork, a mediation process, a final agreement that was cordial in the technical sense of the word, and nothing else. There were nights in that 2-bedroom rental where the quiet was less like peace and more like an absence, and I had to learn the difference. But there is something that happens when you stop fighting for ground that was never yours to begin with. A kind of spaciousness. You realize how much energy you were spending on maintenance, maintaining a version of yourself someone else had decided you should be, maintaining a peace that was really just the absence of confrontation. My father understood that. He'd built his whole life on the difference between what things look like and what they actually are. A man in a flannel shirt and a 12-year-old truck, sitting on 11 properties and a plan he'd never once bragged about. The scholarship fund has now sent 6 students to college in its first year. We've received applications from 31 more for next fall. I review every file personally. Because my father would have, and because it matters. My cousin has joined me as the fund's board co-chair. She brings pastries to our quarterly meetings and argues with me about everything in the way that people who trust each other can. Daniel checks in once a month, out of something that has evolved past professional obligation into something closer to friendship. My office is in the second-floor suite of the East Side building, the one where I sat in the parking lot the morning after everything fell apart. I share the floor with an accountant named Phyllis who has been there since 2003 and brings homemade soup on Fridays. The dentist downstairs is still there, same as she's always been, and her kids are in high school now. I fixed the boiler last spring. 3rd time for that building, which would have made my father laugh. I don't think about my wife often. When I do, it isn't with anger, which surprised me at first. Anger requires a certain ongoing investment, a decision to keep returning to the injury. I found I didn't want to make that investment. What I feel instead, when I think about her at all, is something closer to distance, the same distance you feel looking back at a landscape you've left behind. It was real while you were in it. It's just not where you are anymore. My father left me a letter that said the buildings are just buildings. He was right. But what I've come to understand is that he was also talking about something else. The investments we make in other people. The time, the trust, the ordinary Tuesday mornings, those are buildings too. And some of them you construct with people who are quietly measuring the footprint the entire time, figuring out what they can take when they leave. That's not a reason to stop building. It's just a reason to be more careful about who you hand the keys to. I keep the letter in the drawer of my desk, the one at the East Side office, next to a photograph of my father from 3 years ago, standing in front of that building in one of his 4 flannel shirts, squinting into the sun with the particular expression he always had in photos, like the camera was something he was patiently tolerating. Some mornings I look at it before I start work. Not out of grief, exactly, though the grief is still there, quieter now, folded into other things. I look at it because it reminds me what long games look like. The ones that aren't about winning anything, but about being the kind of person who is worth trusting with something that matters. He was that person. I'm still learning to be. Some stories end loud. The gavel coming down, the headlines, the numbers in a courtroom filing that anyone can look up if they want to see how far a person can fall when they've been building on the wrong foundation. Mine ended quiet. The way most things worth keeping do not with a verdict, but with a Tuesday morning in October, the river road, windows down, the air still trying to decide what season it wants to be. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.